Hello everybody, we've reached the final part of the Conflict and Tension Unit. So far we have revised the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Our final part is how we got from World War I to World War II. We're going to look at Hitler's foreign policy, so his interactions with the nations, and the steps that he took in order to cause World War II. As you're watching this particular PowerPoint, as you're going through this, what I would like you to do, please, is to make notes in any form that makes sense to you. You might want to make a revision clock of stuff on here. There's more to come in the next section as well. This is a two-parter because there's too much to do in one go. So you might want to make a revision clock. You might want to do a mind map. You might just want to take bullet pointed notes and put them into your exercise book. You might want to do flashcards of each of the different slides. It's totally up to you. But what I will say to you is it's really important that you do something. Just watching this isn't enough. You need to make sure that you're interacting with it and doing some form of note taking. Before we start looking at what Hitler did, we need to work out what did he want. So we're going to look at his aims in foreign policy. Foreign policy is simply his interactions and relations with other countries. And of course, his relations and interactions around other countries pretty much revolved around the Treaty of Versailles. So if you remember, when Hitler came to power in 1933, one of his big promises to the German people was that he would abolish or destroy the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler hated the territorial or the land terms and the military terms. He wanted Germany to dominate Europe. It had a position in the centre of Europe, and it made sense for him that Germany was the strongest and most powerful nation. So one of the things that he promised the German people that he would do in the 1930s was he would take back as much land as possible, and he would rebuild the German military. Another thing that he was determined to do, which is linked to the first aim, is reunite German speakers. There were plenty of German citizens who were living under foreign rule. So, for example, you had many Germans living in the Polish corridor. You also had many Germans living in the Sudetenlands in Czechoslovakia. But there were Germans living in many nations now. And what Hitler had promised is those people who were living in foreign rule, that land that they were living in would be reunited with Germany. Number 3 is where Hitler was hoping to expand. So numbers 1 and 2 are just kind of going back to where Germany had been in the past. So making sure that Germany was, that the people who were German were together again. Whereas number 3 was quite a bit different. It was about creating a greater Germany. I said a minute ago that Hitler believed they were in the centre of Europe, they should dominate Europe. Well, he wanted Germany to be this greater Germany. He wanted to merge Germany with surrounding nations, and he wanted to gain something called Lebensraum, that's living space. He believed that the German people were superior or better to many of their neighbours, particularly the neighbours in the east. He saw them as being inferior races, Slavs, and he believed that it was Germany's right to take over those nations. So you can already see from those first 3 aims, he's going to stir up a lot of trouble. The final aim, Hitler believed that Russia, in particular, its system of communism, was completely wrong. It was a system that was totally alien to him. He disliked Russia, he disliked the Russian leader Stalin, and he wanted to destroy that existence of that particular political ideology. So he wanted to get rid of communism throughout Europe. So these were the things that he wanted to achieve. And of course, these things were going to bring him into massive conflict with his neighbours. They were also, if possibly, going to bring him a lot of credibility with the people who voted for him. This lesson focuses on Hitler's early actions between 1933 and 1938. So we already know what it is that Hitler wanted to achieve, and we know that's going to bring him into conflict with his neighbours. So what did he do in this time? We know that Hitler was banned, and Germany was banned by the Treaty of Versailles from rearming. We know that their army was massively limited, as was their navy and air force. So we're going to first of all start off looking at how Hitler began to rearm and re-strengthen Germany. You may also remember that the Saar coalfields, which was a really important area for Germany in terms of actually coal production, the profits from that for 15 years were given to France, and that area was being controlled by the League of Nations. We're going to see what Hitler does about that area. We're going to have a look at the remilitarisation of the Rhineland. If you remember, the Rhineland always remained as German territory. It was never given to another country. It was simply demilitarised. The Germans were told they could never have troops or fortifications in that area again. So we're going to see what Hitler did about that. We're also going to have a look at how Hitler demonstrated his new armaments, his new power in the Spanish Civil War, that's what that means there, and how he made alliances with Japan and Italy, which of course are going to make him stronger. And finally, we're going to have a look at the Anschluss and how he united Germany and Austria, something else that had been banned under the territorial arrangements of the Treaty of Versailles. These are our key focuses today. So if you're thinking about setting up flashcards or you're thinking about bits for your revision clock, these are the areas that you need to be writing about today. Okay, let's get straight into rearmament then. So Hitler came to power in January of 1933 and he began immediately to rearm Germany in secret. Now, the reason that he did it in secret to start with, of course, is at this point he knew that he could easily be stopped. So this was his first step towards destroying the treaty. So as I said at the start of this lesson, that was one of his key aims. He'd promised the German people. Remember, he'd promised them to solve unemployment, get them more jobs, but he was also saying he was going to make Germany great again. And this was his first steps on that path. He also destroyed the League of Nations Disarmaments Conference. There's a disarmaments conference going on at this point, and all the countries were beginning to negotiate about how disarmament was going to happen. But what Hitler did in that conference was he said, we deserve parity with France. In other words, equal treatment. Whatever France is allowed to build up to, we should be allowed the same. So what he was saying is, we need to dispense with the Treaty of Versailles, not think about that. We need to say that countries need to be treated equally. And he said, if France wants to disarm to our level, that would be great. Or we should be allowed to rearm up to the level of France. Of course, France was never going to agree to that, and the disarmament conference collapsed into chaos. What Hitler did at that point as well was he took Germany out of the League of Nations, demonstrating they weren't really going to be cooperating with the world and their neighbours at this point. So very early on, it was obvious that he was going to be different to the previous leaders of Germany. What this did was it undermined the ability of the League of Nations. Now, obviously, we've just studied the League of Nations, and we know that by 1936, 1937, they were pretty much dead anyway. This was one of those early actions that really undermined the League and its powers. So 1933, he's already rearming in secret. He's destroying the League Disarmament Conference and he's withdrawing from the League of Nations. It's clear what his intentions are. In 1934, he did something that was a little bit surprising in some ways, and that you might look at it and go, well, that's not a way that he's going to meet his foreign policy aims and goals. If you remember, we said towards the start of the lesson that one of the things that Hitler wanted to achieve was to destroy the Treaty of Versailles, to reunite German people. Well, one of the key elements in that was to take back some land from Poland. So it might have been quite surprising that in 1934, Hitler signed a 10-year non-aggression pact. 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. Well, the Poles at this point had been threatening to invade Germany. But they got rid of that idea when France said, well, we're not going to help you. So there had been tension between Germany and Poland. And what happened was that actually Hitler realised that at this point he wasn't ever going to be strong enough, not for a while yet, to be able to hurt Poland or attack them or take that land back. So what the 10-year non-aggression pact would do would be to buy him time and mean that Poland weren't going to be suspicious. We're going to be mutually nice to each other. What this was Hitler's first victory over the League's principle of collective security in countries working together with the League. This was Poland, rather than working with the League of Nations, had agreed on a one-to-one treaty. They preferred that rather than League involvement. So the countries resolved their differences together. This was never going to be a pact that worked, but at the moment in 1934, it kind of suited both of them. So Hitler, at this point, hasn't done anything particularly wrong with his 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland, but it's quite a clever step on his road towards kind of getting powerful again. So 1935 is a really important year. We know that in 1933, Hitler began to rearm in secret. By 1935, he felt pretty powerful. His army at this point had risen to 300,000 men. So that's 3 times what it should have been. The airplanes had risen from 36 to 2,500. Remember, this is military aircraft. They should have had none. And in 1935, Hitler introduced conscription, forcing people to join the armed forces. Again, that was banned by the Treaty of Versailles, and formed the proper air force, the Luftwaffe, and held a huge military rally. In other words, it wasn't secret anymore. So rearmament had taken place in secret for 2 years. Now Hitler unleashed it, unveiled it to the world. This showed in public that he had broken the Treaty of Versailles. It publicised the failure of the League, because the League had not been able to secure disarmament. In fact, countries were rearming. Britain and France both did nothing about this. So Hitler is relatively strong at this point with his 300,000 army, but he could at this point easily have been stopped. But Britain and France were talking about in the midst of the Depression, still recovering from that, the League in disarray, issues of course over Abyssinia at this point, they do nothing. But this isn't the end of it. When we talked about the failure of the League of Nations, when we were doing that particular unit, we talked about the self-interest of some of the leading members, and we talked about the betrayal of countries like Britain and France. Britain and France betray the League with their actions over Germany as well. And one of Britain's biggest betrayals is this final point on the step towards rearmament. What we had was the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Now, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement that was signed in the middle of 1935, this again was a one-to-one treaty, nobody's going round the League. Britain agreed to a German navy with a tonnage 1/3 as big as Britain's. In other words, they could have a navy 1/3 the size of Britain's. Now remember that under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany really only allowed 6 battleships. Well, Britain haven't got only 18, so Britain are actively encouraging Hitler to break the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler called it the happiest day of his life. He'd got something he wasn't expecting. He'd kind of got Britain's approval for rearmament. So this was a huge victory for Hitler over the League's principle of collective security, because just like with Poland, Britain had preferred a one-to-one treaty. So, as a result of all of these steps, of course Hitler became stronger militarily, but probably more importantly, this was the beginning of his growth in confidence. He had tested the other nations, he had tested the League, and he had won. No one had tried to stop him on his path to rearmament. What this meant was that he was ready to go even further. The next step on Hitler's pathway to achieving his foreign policy aims isn't one where he does anything wrong, actually. This is just one that comes at a good time for him. So, the Treaty of Versailles had put the Saar coalfields, this particular area of Germany, under League control for 15 years. So for 15 years, as part of the compensation, the reparations package of the Treaty of Versailles, the French had had access to the coal from that region as payment for the destruction of the French coalfields in World War I. So this was not a territorial or a land arrangement, this was to do with compensation, reparations. So in 1935, a plebiscite, a vote, a referendum on a single issue was held to see if the people of the Saar wished to return to Germany. So they were going to be given the choice. Do you want to, be part of Germany again? Within Germany, there was some opposition to the Saar returning. The Communists and the Social Democrats waged a united front campaign on this. This was, remember that at this point in time, there is no political opposition allowed in Germany. They're in hiding and secretly getting communications out, telling the people of the Saar to vote against joining Germany, because this would be a massive humiliation for Hitler. If they could just get the people of the Saar to say no to this, it would look as if Hitler was doing a bad job of ruling Germany. In the Saar, the Nazis beat up their opponents. 17,000 Saarlanders, people from the Saar, who had joined the Nazi SA in Germany, threatened to invade. So the area was it was a melting pot of problems. It was all very chaotic at this point. The British had threatened to send in soldiers to calm the area down, to make sure that the voting took place in calm, controlled conditions, but it wasn't needed in the end. So in January 1935, the vote was finally held. And despite the actions of the Communists and the Social Democrats, it was a massive victory for Hitler. 90.3% of the people who lived in the Tsar and had the ability to vote voted to return to Germany. This was a triumph for Hitler. He defeated the communists, he defeated the Social Democrats, and it showed that the people of Germany were behind the Treaty of Versailles being destroyed, and they hadn't enjoyed the rule of the League of Nations, and that the League of Nations was further humiliated by this. So Hitler's done nothing wrong apart from potentially stirring up trouble in the Tsar, but this is a perfectly legal, legitimate return of this piece of land to Germany. Also, of course, not only is it a triumph for him diplomatically, but also he's got this coal back. This coal is going to be vital in helping him power the factories that are making him rearm Germany. Those factories are going to be making the weapons, the tanks, the planes, etc. The next event is probably the most important one that we've looked at so far. So if you remember, we talked earlier about how the Treaty of Versailles had demilitarised the Rhineland. The Rhineland was now permanently demilitarised, no troops, no fortifications, etc. And Germany had accepted it under the Treaty of Versailles, which they signed. Obviously, we know that they didn't do that particularly willingly, but they had re-agreed to this at the Locarno Treaty of 1925. So this had been confirmed. No troops, no weapons allowed, and it was all about buying France security, because France had been invaded twice through invasions from the Rhineland in 1870 and in 1940. So what's the background to this? Well, in 1936, France and Russia, the USSR, they signed a defensive alliance. Now, what Hitler claimed at this point was that this was a direct threat to Germany, because this meant that his neighbours in the west, France, and his neighbours in the east, Russia, were now surrounding him and were allied with each other. And just like they had been allied in World War I and managed to crush them from either side, this is what Hitler feared again. So he said this was a direct threat to German security. Britain, France, and the League of Nations, at this point in 1936, they were also busy with the Abyssinian crisis. So this was a great time for Hitler to take action in the Rhineland, because he had the kind of excuse of what was happening with France and Russia, and saying that he felt threatened and felt insecure. And he also had the distraction of those other countries, which meant that 1936 might be a good time to do this. So on the 7th of March 1936, Hitler ordered his army to go into the Rhineland. So remember, this is not an invasion. This remained German territory, and that's really important for how other countries kind of reacted to this. So Hitler at this point wasn't particularly confident that he would get away with it. This was seen as a real gamble for Hitler. He referred to it later as a gamble. It was a gamble that he played and he won. But what he said to his army was that if you go in and you receive any opposition from the French, you need to retreat. You need to go backwards. You need to come straight back home, because he felt that his army at this point was not strong enough to fight the French. So if the French oppose you, if the French stop you, turn back, come round. The French did nothing. They received absolutely no challenge whatsoever. So on the 7th of March, the troops marched into the Rhineland. Nobody did anything. Britain and France as a whole did nothing, and into the Rhineland themselves, the German troops were welcomed as heroes. Loads and loads of newsreels and photographs were taken, and Hitler was able to use that for propaganda purposes later, because he had had a massive victory. The League of Nations, well, they do their usual. They condemned the action. They said, oh, this is not very good, Hitler. We don't like what you've done here. But they gave no sanctions. They did nothing about it. So France, the neighbours, the people who had really, really fought for the demilitarisation of the Rhineland, they took no action. The British, they took no action. And the League of Nations took no action. So this was a huge victory for Hitler. So by this point, remember what he's already achieved. He has begun to rearm Germany. This is already out in the open now. He's got that deal with the British, the deal with the Poles. He has already got the Tsar back that's going to really help him with his factories. And now he has remilitarised the Rhineland with really no problems whatsoever. He had now openly broken the Treaty of Versailles. He did it with rearmament from 1935 onwards. And he's done it now with the remilitarisation of the Rhineland. He's beaten the British and the French. The British and the French thought that he was more powerful than he was. He's done nothing. The British, in fact, the reason they took no action was because this was German land, this was German territory. They didn't want to go to war over what they said was Germany putting troops into their own backyard. So what Hitler began to believe at this point, and this is really important psychologically, is that Britain and France would always back down. He believed you could pretty much do anything, and it encouraged him to do even more. And that's what he does over this next couple of years. We haven't seen at all so far how Hitler was beginning to destroy communism. And he doesn't really do very much until 1936, 1937. In 1936, a civil war had broke out in Spain. Now, this was between the communists, who of course Hitler hated, and right-wing rebels under General Franco. Well, Hitler, he likes General Franco. He thinks that he's got some good ideas. He's got a similar kind of philosophy to power to Hitler. They all hate communists. So Hitler saw this as an opportunity to fight against communism. He hasn't been able to fight against the Russians yet and destroy Russian communism. But maybe, just maybe, he can destroy communism and stop it from spreading further. But also, it's going to allow him to try out his new armed forces. He had been expanding, we know, his air force in particular. What this war would do was give him the opportunity to demonstrate what his air force could do. So in 1937, the German Luftwaffe, the German aircraft, they made devastating bombing raids on civilian populations in Spanish cities. So this was bombing innocent people, bombing raids. And one town that was pretty much completely destroyed was Guernica. So Hitler demonstrated this to the world. This was terrifying. More on that in a second. So results, well, Mussolini and the Italians, they had also been there helping General Franco to defeat the communists. And what this meant was that Germany and Italy realised that they actually had loads in common. Loads and loads in common. And so at that point, they signed the 1936 Rome-Berlin Axis, where they agreed that they were going to form an alliance because they realised that they had the hatred of communism in common. That then was added to and formed into the full Anti-Comintern Pact in 1937. This was an alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Look at these three countries. These are the three countries that have all caused real problems for the League of Nations. So Germany destroying their disarmament conference, walking out, and then making one-to-one deals with countries. Italy, who of course had caused all those problems in Abyssinia, and the Japanese, who had caused those problems in Manchuria. So the aim of those countries coming together was to limit communism around the world. They were going to try and stop it spreading, work together as a three. So the Anti-Comintern Pact there, they formed what was known as the Axis Alliance at this point, the Axis Alliance. So these three now, kind of the bad boys of foreign policy, bad boys of the world, are all kind of teaming up together. And this, of course, meant that Hitler became even stronger. The other thing about the Spanish Civil War and the Anti-Comintern Pact was that it's what the world saw. In particular, it's what the British saw. The British public saw the newsreels of what happened in Spain. They saw pictures of the destruction of cities. They saw dead Spanish children. And this made them more determined to avoid future war. And that's going to lead on to what we look at in our next PowerPoint, where we're going to be looking at the policy of appeasement. It made the British people more frightened of war than they ever had been. Britain being an island, they had been worried about a sea-based invasion, but really Britain had been pretty safe from any attacks on civilian populations in previous wars. What the British realised at this point was, in a future war, they were not going to be safe. This brings us to our final event from today. So, the Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Anschluss. They had forbidden the union of Austria and Germany. But in Mein Kampf, in Hitler's book, My Struggle, he had demanded that Austria should be part of this Greater Germany. So this wasn't going to be something about, I guess it was in a way breaking the Treaty of Versailles because it had been forbidden, but this was about expanding Germany. This was about Germany's right to take over surrounding territories. So what was the background? Well, right from the very beginning of Hitler's time in power, there had been Nazis spreading throughout Austria. So in 1934, the Austrian Nazis had rebelled against the government and they had murdered the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss. It looked in 1934 as if Hitler was going to take over Austria. Hitler had wanted to help the Austrian Nazis and really push the advantage and take over the government. But Mussolini, bear in mind this is 1934, there's no alliance between Italy and Germany at this point, he moved his army to the Austrian border. He said, if you take over Austria, we will fight you. Hitler had only been rearming for 1 year, he was in no position to fight, and so he backed down. By 1936, of course, we've got the Rome-Berlin axis, we've got the union between those two countries. This made Hitler more secure that next time when there was an opportunity, that he would be able to be more successful in the taking over of Austria. So he got his opportunity in January of 1938. The Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg had banned the Austrian Nazi Party. They had been causing a huge amount of trouble in Austria, and he arrested and threw into jail its leaders. And this was in order to restore order in Austria. Because of that ban and because of the arrests, in February of 1938, the Austrian Nazis rioted. They called for Anschluss. They said now is the time for the union. And at this point, Hitler felt confident enough to properly support them. Britain, France, and Italy all did nothing. Now, Italy, because obviously now they're friends with Germany, but the other two just did nothing. Schuschnigg decided that there should be a plebiscite. So he said he's the Chancellor of Austria, he's the man in charge, and he said, okay, if you want to take over my country, do it legally. Let's see what the Austrian people want. Do they want to be ruled by Hitler? Do they want to be part of this Greater Germany? As he said it, to know whether the Austrian people wanted to be free. So on the 11th of March 1938, to prevent the vote, the plebiscite, Hitler invaded. He knew that in March 1938, if there was a vote held, he hadn't been able to get his propaganda out as much as he wanted to. He hadn't been able to do what he wanted to do. He felt there was a real chance that he could lose. So now that he'd been in power, in April 1938, he arrested 20,000 people, Austrians, who he felt were troublemakers and may stop him from winning a vote. He held the promised vote, the plebiscite. This vote was massively controlled by the German army, and out of the people who did turn up to vote, 99.75% voted for the Anschluss. So this was a dramatic and massive victory for Hitler and the Nazis. So this was really, really important because this was now Hitler actually taking over another country. The first time he'd done this, because remember when he'd marched into the Rhineland, that was still German. It was a huge victory for Germany. Again, Hitler had broken the Treaty of Versailles. He'd again, really shown that Britain and France weren't going to put up any opposition to him. It convinced him that Britain and France would always back down. And yet again, it was another event that encouraged him to go further. He didn't think anyone was ever going to stop him at this point. Chamberlain, who was at this point the new British Prime Minister, he realised that only military intervention would have stopped Hitler. And at that point, the British weren't willing to use military intervention. They'd seen the Spanish Civil War, they didn't want to get into that, but also this was Germans taking over more German territory. People saw Austria as being German. They had the same culture, history, and language. Up until 1870, they had been one nation. This didn't seem to make sense that Britain would go to war over this. And it convinced Chamberlain to use the policy of appeasement. More in our next session. So in a moment, you're going to go back to your teacher. You're going to have a look at, how many of his aims he had achieved. How much destruction of the Treaty of Versailles had he achieved? How much had he managed to reunite German speakers? How much had he created a greater Germany? How much had he destroyed communism? What I would like you to do is have a think about how these actions that he did match with the aims. For example, rearming of Germany, well, of course, it was helping him to destroy Versailles. Look at these and see if you can match them up. Some of the actions may meet more than one aim. Have a think about it, and then make sure you return to your teacher for the last 5 minutes of the lesson.